Teodoro Obiang.
How are you doing? He's hoping that all is well with you. Thank you so very much for being a part of the program and taking your time to join us. The name of the show is Debate 411. Right here on the program, we get to discuss and sometimes, of course, debate critical issues that are of importance to you, and of course get to hear your views from wherever you are. And it's very simple. All you need to do is get in touch with us, and there are various ways of you joining this conversation that we'll be having right here on the program, and that is by Twitter at Debate411. That's the handle. Or you can tweet me directly at Eugene Anangwe, and you can always use the hashtag Debate411. As I said, as always, I'm Eugene Anangwe, and today we're talking about the issue of Africa and its problems. Can Africa solve its own problems without requiring intervention from other countries that are not in Africa? The slogan, African solutions to African problems. Is it just a saying? Is it just a, just a thought? Is it practical? Can we do it? These are some of the things that we'll be talking about right here on the program. Start tweeting. Tell us your thoughts, whether you believe in African solutions to African problems and whether that is even possible. To help us understand that even better is none other than Patrick, who is the director of Bonesha FM in Burundi, and he's here in Rwanda right now. Thank you for joining us, Patrick.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in the studio.
Thank you so much. Archie Henry is not new to this show, and of course to your faces is a reporter on Contact FM. Thank you so much for joining us, Archie.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Good evening.
Right. Missing in action is none other than Thierry Gatete. He'll be joining us a bit later on in the program to help us understand his way or thoughts on this particular issue. For him, he believes that it is true. Africa is actually solving its own problems, and it can definitely do that. But Patrick, just from where you come from, home in Burundi, there's a deep crisis that is going on right there. And of course, this is one of those examples that most of people are saying, look at what is going on in Burundi. We are now seeking the intervention of outsiders to come and sort our issue. For you, this statement, is it just a slogan, or do you believe in it? African problems can be solved by African solutions.
the case of my country is just an example of proving the failure of such a good ideal, African problem for African solution.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's just a slogan. Look how the crisis is going from bad to worse in Burundi. The indicators of a big crisis were there since before. How is the East African region, for instance, is reacting on what is going on in Burundi? I'm talking about the East African community because Burundi is a member of the East African community. I'm blaming the community, East African community. I'm blaming the Great Lakes region. There I'm talking about two organizations, East African Community and International Great Lakes Conference, which are neighbors to Burundi. They were supposed to intervene since before.
And they've taken too long to even intervene.
They took long, and is now that, even now, East Africa community is not moving. We can say African Union, of course, and also because of the will of the chair of African Union, Madame Zuma, who influenced or even pushed things forward to tell the Peace and Security Council for African Union to take a number of resolutions on Burundi. Otherwise, it's just European Union, which started to alert, even taking sanctions against those committing
when those close along to
Burundi
Burundi are not really acting properly.
Yeah.
Let me bring in Archie here. What is difficult for this, what he says is just a slogan, to be turned into a reality? What is so difficult for Africa to say, you know what, we will unite and talk about our problems and actually come up with homegrown solutions to them? What's so hard with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And on the subject of Burundi, Patrick, you were mentioning the African Union. There's a lot of hope being put in the African Union by different actors around the continent, because the African Union is the top institution on the continent. And indeed, on the Burundian crisis, the African Union was actually very vocal, was the most vocal of all in Africa. It proposed sanctions recently. It condemned the third term. It condemned the violation of Arusha Agreement, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But the issue for the African Union is that it still remains dependent, whether we like it or not, on the international order, on the international system. It remains dependent on the United Nations.
Is this a valid reason?
Even by law,
yes.
There's a UN, there's a charter in the, there's an article in the AU Charter, African Union Charter, which says that in the case of a crisis or a conflict, for there to be a rapid deployment of an African Union force to prevent massacres, to protect civilians, it would have to be approved by the United Nations Security Council.
Yes,
system,
I get your point.
Yeah.
But Patrick, do you feel this is a reason enough for the African Union not to act, or even individual African countries to say, you know what, this is what we'll do practically to solve some of our problems in the continent? That we have strings attached. Even when we want to react, we have, the Western nations pulling strings for us to act.
Yeah, when it comes to, for instance, deployment of troops, even if we have such a mechanism like Archie mentioned, now recently that contingent of African Union, which will be in charge of intervening in the country facing crimes against humanity, like in Burundi today, we have a contingent of 5,500 troops. Now they have finished their training, but I'm sure, even if the resolution is coming from African Union to deploy them in Burundi, for instance, you will hear that there is a problem of what? Of budget. Then they will start asking money where? From Western countries. So you see the problem,
There's a problem of budget, and it's also reflected in training. When we talk about security, conflict prevention, conflict management, African states, African militaries are still extremely dependent on funding from the United States, funding from Europe, especially the United States, when we're talking about the East African region. And that's not necessarily a criticism of African states, but that's a reality. And maybe indeed African nations, African leaders...
But why would we need funding to stop conflict in our countries? Thank you so much for joining us, Gatete. Of course, for you, you feel that this is not a slogan. African solutions are actually solving African problems, and you believe this is very practical, it's really working.
Yes.
And then they're here saying we are not be able to act because we have to wait for the Western countries to approve some of the actions that we might want to do to solve our problems.
See, that's simplistic to say that money is just one factor. But African solutions are solving African problems, but Africans are not being let to experiment their own homegrown solutions, because the moment you start implementing home-generated solutions, you have to face at the same time criticism and pressure from the international community. Now, this when I came in, I heard Henry talking about money, the aspect of money. But I do not think the problem, as far as countries like Burundi is concerned, the reason the African Union or the East African community cannot intervene is because of the money.
Yeah, totally agree
right?
with you.
But
It's one of the factors, eventually.
But let's get
that
deeper
is
into
not
that.
the
Yes.
That's not a factor in the discussion. That's not being factored into a discussion. The money that's, let's say, troops in any of these neighboring countries in the region are being paid can still continue to be paid. These are equipped. It's not a factor. It's an aspect of peacekeeping. But if, for example, if they were given that liberty to intervene, if Burundi, for example, cooperated and said, we want peacekeepers here, or peace enforcers in this case, it wouldn't be a money problem. Money actually has not been a problem to Africa not experimenting African problems. The West, which in fact tries to get Africa to implement its models, has been practicing literally scrounging of African resources.
Right.
And so that money issue isn't really the problem.
So you feel it's a petty point when we say that it's money, we need money for them, and they're the ones who are paying us. But let's take the debate even further, and would not just probably restrict ourselves to Burundi. But before we came on this program, you had said that this slogan or this statement that African problems can be solved by African solutions, and homegrown solutions are actually being put in place to prove that this slogan can really work. How can you justify that when we have situations like we're seeing? Even in Kenya, in 2007, 2008, we had to wait for the ICC to come in and the Kofi Annans.
But exactly, right? So first of all, let's just agree that we live in a world where ideologies are not their problem. It's who utilizes them for other interests that is the problem. So African solutions, if you look at the country that you just mentioned, Kenya, what was it? It was a post-conflict, post-electoral conflict. So it was a post-democratic conflict. That's how you'd call it. There was a democratic process that
Post-election, yeah.
So election isn't that a hallmark of a democratic process? Now, elections in Africa are actually a source of conflict consistently. It's a recurrent problem. Every time we have elections, you can expect conflict to come up.
Yes, but
What
you can,
expect
the conflicts to happen, but solutions to those conflicts.
Now,
can we find solutions
there are
to those
two
conflicts
things.
without seeking intervention?
There's one fact,
I'm
if I
seeing
may
two
jump in.
countries.
Yes, yes.
Just, and then I'm done.
Yes.
I'm seeing two countries in Africa. I'm seeing Ethiopia and Rwanda, which have actually decided that they will experiment their homegrown approaches to governance, regardless of the pressures and the criticism and so on from the rest of the world. And in fact, these countries, since they started doing that, it's been working so far, regardless of... And I've seen experts, for example, who said Burundi has finally understood what democracy is and it's on its way towards peace, and Rwanda is the country that's going to have conflict. That's 2 years ago. Experts are on record saying that.
You mean
Today,
experts?
I mean, everyone these days comes here and says an expert. Today, the opposite actually happened. But this is not only true for Africa. Take the Asian dragons. The only countries in this world that have come after post-independence countries, that have come from third world to first world, in this world are countries that have said, these Western models, keep them to yourselves, we will experiment our own approach, we'll experiment our own solutions.
Yes.
And that's the Asian dragons.
Yes. Just hold that thought, and because that statement that he makes brings us to another key element where there are those who are arguing and saying, even these things that you call are African problems, they are not African problems. They were not caused by us. These are things that we aped from the Western countries, and they have found us in these situations which we are now fighting with. For example, when it comes to the definition of democracy and what needs to be done for you to say that this was democratic. Some of these countries are saying, we have our way of thinking, but since we all aped the way the West wanted us to think, now we have adapted a problem that is not ours. Do you believe these problems we're facing were not made by us, Africans? These were things that were created by our colonialists?
Africa has accepted democracy. And since a couple of years, we are no longer witnessing people acceding to power after military coup. People have accepted that if you want to access to power, there is a process. One of the processes is election, is a competition.
Which was brought by who?
Brought by who?
Yes.
Do you think
this concept of election being...
I remember in Burundi we had elections in 1961. It was 1 year after, it was before independence. So, democracy was there. But it's just a dynamic process. So, I think it's an excuse. We are creating problems ourselves. We agreed on the principles that people, leaders, if you want to have power, you need to go to seek votes to the citizens, presenting them your projects. Then, after a certain time, they will evaluate what has been implemented. So, while it comes to conflict, now people will say, oh, it's because the Western has interfered in our affairs and whatever. That's an excuse,
right?
Which is not really can't be justified. Yeah.
And I tend to actually agree with Patrick's position. You were mentioning African problems. Are they inherited from colonial powers? But these problems are happening in African countries right now, today, on the African continent. And to come back also to what Gatete was saying earlier, if you just look at, has there been even one example in the history of Africa, where African states, African institutions have taken their own initiative
to come up with a solution?
To come up with a solution, especially in the domain of conflict, or there's a crisis. Now I'm talking about like if there's a war. They've always had to go through the UN. I think that's a shame. We can blame that on the system, on the international system.
Yes. No,
and it's a shame when there's a crisis, when there's a conflict. For example, you talk about Burundi. East African countries have to watch this conflict happening in that doorstep with refugees flowing in, and they're seeing all this happening firsthand, and they have to wait for New York in order then to go to Addis.
So you believe that it's just a slogan?
I agree with Patrick, but I think it's a systemic problem.
3 points to this.
You don't agree?
I don't agree.
Yes.
Humbly. Albeit. Point number one is that Africa does not... what they're saying that Africa agreed to establishing a process where everyone access to power like this and like that, and then they don't implement it. First of all, Africa does not agree to these processes. These processes are brought as models, and you have to follow them. I remember...
And when it doesn't work, we have crisis,
and
which
they're out.
Yes.
And the people who brought those experiments are not there anymore. But I remember when the Gacaca were initiated in this country, and that's definitely a model that is drawn from our history and culture. When it was implemented here, when it came, and Gacaca is not something far-fetched, it's Rwandan, but it's even beyond Rwandan. It's a normal African conflict management mechanism. I remember experts coming and saying this approach is not right this approach is not going to work because these principles of law and international law that are not being respected. It was able to work to reconcile people who killed and people who were victims. A process that billions and billions of dollars of an international jurisdiction was not able to address. Now, coming back to the issue of going before Africa implements a project, has to go through
New York.
Well, this is not true for Africa only. This is true for Ireland with the Catholics and Protestants. This is true for the Middle East.
Of course.
This is true for everywhere in the world. We live in a world which used to be monopolar world, in which in this community of nations you cannot conduct war single-handedly. And when you do, you can face international consequences to it. But that's how the world is. Now, I'm not going to go back into whether we need to change the world. That's not my point. We just have to understand that you have to negotiate how you can domesticate all these. These concepts are very good. Democracy. First of all, that's a Greek word that you make an English word. We have to translate it to Kinyarwanda if you want to implement it here. Mm-hmm. By translating, I mean we have to domesticate it.
So what Thierry is saying here is that we have sort of adopted models. Mm-hmm. He's sort of bashing what you said earlier on, that we have agreed on these things, yet it was not us who decided on them. And after adopting them, when they go wrong, we are the ones who face the consequences, and therefore inheriting problems that were not ours as Africans. And when we want to come up with our own models, the West is always out to criticize.
We have to blame on ourselves. Mm-hmm. Africa, the big problem we have is the leadership. Leadership is problem number one. Leaders, they pretend to be there for the second interest of the people. But after a while, they do not even respect the people who brought them there.
Yes.
We have so many cases. Mm-hmm. The topic is African problem to an African solution. Why this is not implemented, mm-hmm. although it is in the mouth of all African leaders? Mm-hmm. First of all, there is this what I can call solidarity between leaders. I'm not intervening in my neighbor problem because we are facing the same problem. Maybe tomorrow it will be me.
Yeah.
Sort
of like Russia and China.
Yeah.
In the greater scale.
Although I blame the East African community for not acting, even now, on the Burundi crisis.
But how do we deal with this leadership problem which you mentioned?
At the same time,
yes.
Let me just finish this. Yes. At the same time, I praise West Africa leaders, how they dealt with the Burkina Faso problem. When this general attempted a coup against the transitional president, you saw they stood up all together. Senegal president, Benin president, who else again?
Could it have happened because of this unity of purpose that you're saying? Because they said maybe tomorrow it will be me. So we have to unite as a bloc and say, you know what? We do not want this to happen.
For that case, they really went there to prevent a crisis. Mm-hmm. And they said Burkina Faso is in a transitional period. You want to join again democracy, build democratic institutions, and let's help our brothers. Because if the fire is there, mm-hmm. can cross and come to burn our houses. Mm-hmm. This is really a good example of that African problem, African solution.
However, mm-hmm. the dynamics.
So there is exception.
Yes.
For that, are really praising them. Mm-hmm. But again, as I said, what is happening now in Burundi is a shame for East Africa. Mm-hmm. I'm blaming especially Tanzania and the outgoing president, Kikwete, who knew very well the principles. We talked about Arusha Agreement. We signed the Arusha Agreement in Tanzania after years of conflict, and we came up with a pact deal, how there will be a democratic alternance, how people will share power. We identified the rules of crisis in Burundi. So Kikwete knew that. Then he came to Burundi. He advised Nkurunziza not at least to violate the Constitution and Arusha Peace Agreement, to force for another term, but after a while, he changed his mind and backed Nkurunziza. I'm blaming today President Museveni, who knew very well Burundi's situation. He helped us to have a peace deal and have a peace. But now, people are killed every day by the leadership, and they are not reacting.
So you see the problem, or you're saying the problem here is the leadership.
Yeah.
And this is one of the problems which we need to solve. And the question is, can we solve that problem with African solutions? Can African leaders sit in a room and just say, we are looking for a solution to this problem of, defying constitutions and deaths by, in the hands of those who are still in power? Can we get solutions to those ones? Can we do this?
Yes.
And why are we not doing it for the case of Burundi?
First of all, no one else cares about Africans. So let's just come, the whole concept of wondering whether there will be anyone else actually solving African problems. It's never happened before. It's not going to happen. No one cares about you. It's up to you. You deal with your mess. You don't deal with it, you die. That's simple. But on this issue, I'm 100% with him on the East African communities. Burundi is the stumbling block. Mm-hmm. Burundi has actually revealed what the East African community is. A completely weak institution that probably is going to advance economic agendas.
So when we come back, we'll be looking at what solutions East African community or other African nations should have done. In this case, for example, the conflict in Burundi and other conflicts that we continue to see, Central Africa Republic, all these particular African problems of conflict when it comes to electioneering processes and after election process. How can we find practical solutions as a continent and say this, we're kicking out of this continent? And so we have peace every time we have elections throughout. So these are some of the things that we'll be talking about right here when we come back. We're seeing some of your tweets coming through. Of course, Akinore, thank you so much for the tweet. You have definitely called upon many people to watch and be able to participate on this particular problem of solving African problems. And of course, More Love Juice, thank you so much. You said earlier on that we had already had democracy before the Muzungu. What we are now dealing with vis-a-vis the Muzungu is neoliberalism. We'll definitely munch that even more right here when we come back. Keep tweeting. All you need to do is use the hashtag debate411. Be part of the conversation. How best do you think Africa can solve its own problems? And is Africa even ready yet to be saying that we will be on the steering wheel? We do not need foreign intervention to solve our problems. Is that even possible? When we come back, we'll talk more.
hahira muri Nakumatt City na Nakumatt Kigali City Tower maze uryoherwe n'igabanuka ry'ibiciro ringana na 50% ku mayeswime y'ubwoko butandukanye. Koresha aya mahirwe uhabwe itapi wihitiyemo kuri kimwe cya kabiri cyayo wari bwishyure. Ihute ntutangwe. Amategeko n'amabwiriza birakurikizwa.
Nakumatt, you need it. We've got it.
So Natasha, are we cornering our teachers? Are we being unfair to them?
At the end of the day, Fiona also mentions that the more you show them this condom, the more you're opening up their mind to having sex. But do you feel well represented? Do you think the media issues are well taken to the table when it comes to advocacy? How do we convince them and say that we shut it down because you exceeded the limits? The word conservation looks just complicated, but how do we simplify this?
What role do our schools play then? And the people around our children, what role can they play in order to avoid these children becoming a menace in the society?
Caroline, you just want to sound moral, but you're just not accepting the reality on the ground.
Well, I want to sound moral and encourage it and practice it.
This is an EA production.
Shop at Nakumatt TTC and Nakumatt Kigali City Tower and enjoy 50% discounts on home living face towels, bath towels, and hand towels. Grab this great opportunity and get yourself selected carpets at a half price. Hurry, hurry, hurry while stocks last.
Terms and conditions apply. Nakumatt, you need it. We've got it.
And welcome back. Thank you so much for making time to still be with us on the next break of the program. This is Debate 4-on-1. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. We are definitely talking about African problems. You know them. You know a lot of them. And if you do not know, some of them are involved with conflict. And, of course, others, it's poverty. Sometimes when it comes to, economic issues, we all have problems, sometimes diseases. But can we find solutions to them without seeking foreign intervention? Can we say, we do not need the West to intervene on this one. We got it under control as Africa. These are some of the things we're asking right here. Do you believe that can happen? The statement, African solutions to African problems, is it real or is it just a slogan? These are some of the things we're talking about right here on the program. I have Thierry Gatete, I have Patrick of Bonesha FM in Burundi, and of course Archie Henry. Before we went for the break, we definitely promised to read some of the comments right here. I have Gatera Antoni, who's on Facebook, and the Facebook page is Eugene Anangwe. He says, brother, we Africans, we can't solve our problems ourselves. Number one, problems in Africa have roots in those Western countries. For example, see the problems in Libya. Can Gatete tell me if democracy, human rights, justice are African initiatives? He feels that these were things that were even brought by the Western nations. The definition of democracy, the definition of justice.
Right.
Did we do them ourselves?
If you say them in English like that, they are certainly Western words. But we had systems of governance which included that. Now, the person who just tweeted you, I would introduce him to a concept called the GADA. Now, it's the Ethiopian, the Oromo, to be precise, it's the Oromo governance system. It's deep-rooted, and this is a country that has not been colonized. So, this is a system of governance which ensured that every citizen participated. They had graduation, you had roles to play from tender age growing up. You should, if we can put on your space some of the documentation on the GADA system. Now in Rwanda we had systems of governance, we had courts. In East Africa we had barazas and so on. The concept of democracy is the rule by the people. Now in Rwanda, if you were not illegitimate, and in Burundi you had Bashingantahe, whose job was to guarantee that the king is serving the people. And in fact, these gentlemen were very important to telling the king where he has erred. In fact, in Rwanda, we had the same system. You could only be a leader if you were legitimate. And by legitimacy, you mean if you are serving the interest of the people.
Yes. As you continue, the fact that he says had, this now insinuates that we no longer do these things. And it means we have replaced that with something. And probably this is the concern of this viewer here, that we seem to have left what was our homegrown, or what were our homegrown solutions to our problems, and we've adapted to the systems of the West, which are probably not working for us today. Patrick?
Probably that the system didn't work to some extent. We moved from the colonial period. But even during the colonial period, we used to have, I'm talking about maybe the case, I think, in Rwanda and Burundi, we used to have kingdom. Then, after we got independence, we had the leaders who helped us to have independence, who were in charge, But after that came up a military regime. Then the military regime took long, everywhere in the African continent. But after that came another system just to give up with people coming to power after a military coup, after even bloodshed. The principles. So for me, democracy is universal. We cannot escape.
You don't believe that it's a copy-paste thing?
It's not a copy-paste. It's the way you implement it, taking into account your values, African values. You know, it's not really a copy-paste. It's a universal principle, and we need to do that. Yeah.
But Archie, as you come in as well, then why is it that in certain situations, if he says it's universal, if it happens, if it works here, it can work, anywhere else? Yeah. But why is it that when we have some of the Western nations coming in and saying, you know what, we do not want you to do like this.
The principle is there.
African leaders usually say, but this is our way of doing things, let us be. If you really believe in what he says, that it's universal.
Right, no, of course, but I think beyond thinking always about sort of Africa versus the West, and Africa being manipulated by the West, which it certainly is in some occasions, we should be thinking about human values above all. Human values, whether you're African, European, Latin American, Asian. And indeed, you were asking before, what could be changed, what solutions more could be added right now today? I still think the fundamental problem as to why African states, African leaders, are still very dependent on Western nations to solve their own problems is because of the system of how it is. The United Nations. And I think that what can be done more, an effort that I haven't been seeing, is more lobbying efforts from African individual states, from regional bodies, from the African Union, lobbying to international organizations, or lobbying to the United Nations, asking them for removing that provision in the AU Charter, which asks for UN Security Council permission. I think that's a fundamental thing. Before African states will be fully independent, there needs to be more effort from African states to ask for that ability to be independent. And I feel like these institutional limits that there are in the world system are actually making African states more disengaged, more passive, less proactive.
Yes.
They need to be more proactive to change that.
Yes, Gatete will be coming in. But Patrick, do you feel that that is a valid point? Because it sort of looks like you need to beg us to implement something that will be of great help for you. That this is sort of what Archie is saying. Africans need to lobby and then, push for this. Should we? Is this what we need to solve our own problems?
No. We just need a political will. A political will, and also to really master these democratic principles, accountability. If you are there, you have been put there by your own people. Please respect them. Please do what you promised to them. And once you are not doing that, accept that there is a process, at least, to change things. Accept that if there is a competition, there is a winner, there is a loser. Don't cheat. Don't manipulate the elections. Don't put pressure on those in charge of monitoring elections or chairing elections, like electoral commissions. Put pressure on them. Bribing them. This is the problem. You are there, you accept the rules of the game,
and you play by those rules.
Yeah.
You need to play by those rules.
Yeah.
This is what you're saying.
Yeah.
But Gatete, this is mostly the problem in Africa. Every time there's an election, Thierry, there are those who always sometimes flee. Some investors say, let's keep our money. Why should this always be the situation?
Because elections are not an answer to the actual problem at hand. Now, I just want to come back to a point that listening my colleagues talking about the failures of African governance. I just want to tell you a quick story. When the United States operate the revolution. The how do they call them? The revolution.
Yes.
1771. They have people like George Washington, people like Madison, Franklin, Benjamin Franklin. They have so many savants, so many thinkers. And these are the people who will shape the democracy, the stable democracy that Americans have today. Because in Europe, for Europe to get to the democratic stability that they had hundreds of years of war and killings until they reached a level where they could
Jump onto the point.
Now, to think that Africans have been systemically, inherently weak or lacked intelligence is not true. Because at the wake of the African independence, we have similar human beings as those that similar enlightened human beings as those that Americans had. Because my friend is Burundian, I'll speak of Rwagasore. In Rwanda we have Rudahigwa, we have Nkuruma, we have Lumumba, and these are individuals who have taken time. These are individuals who have fought for independence. So they've taken time to understand what independence means and what they can do with it.
But you still haven't answered my question.
Yes.
Why is it that every time we go for elections, some countries in Africa, we have to get worried?
These are individuals who prepared themselves to, when they're independent, what they will do with their people. Now, the whole layer of African revolutionary leaders, Machel and these individuals, were all decimated, systemically killed, removed, and so on.
So those that replaced them
and they
were not of the same
by individuals
thoughts
who never actually literally given a thought as to what it is they want. In fact, the person who was put in Rwanda as president was a person who was asking the Belgians to give independence progressively in 25 years. He emanated for a party like that. The person who was saying, we want independence now because we think we are ready, was actually killed. That tells
so what's your point?
Same thing in Congo, you have people like Kasavubu and Mobutu and so on. So what I'm saying is, what would have happened to America if Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and all these thinkers of the time who are ready to take over after the revolution, if they were all decimated that day and find adventurers and put them in their place? What would have happened? So in Africa, the reason they breed, the second time I'm not very old, but the second time I start to experience human beings who remind me of those African heroes is the Kagames, is the Meles Zenawis of Ethiopia. It's today. It's the Mugabes of Zimbabwe. Mugabe started, he was fought because he was reminding me of the people who wanted African independence then.
Thank you, Thierry. But Archie and Patrick, listening to what he's saying and listening to or seeing the reality on the ground in terms of the problems that we have today, especially what is just happening across the border, do you feel what Thierry is saying is just blah, blah, blah?
Honestly, I think so. I mean, I definitely see your point, but I feel like you're being defensive, even though we're just stating a reality. We're not saying that, we're not criticizing African leaders or African governments for being backwards. We're stating that this is the way things are right now, and that their progress needs to be made. And whatever is the past, move on from there and be resilient and work and stop thinking about the past. And move towards being independent, work hard for it, work hard to be independent from the UN, from the EU, from the US.
How can you do that?
Practical problem
how
and practical
is that
solution.
possible?
Yes.
You work for it. You have brilliant leaders. You cultivate brilliant leaders. You have the effective mechanisms to dialogue with these international institutions.
Patrick,
there's definitely a way. You can't be so cynical.
Let me bring in Patrick there, because Patrick, earlier on you also mentioned that these leaders that we elect have to really adhere to these principles of democracy. He says we, have a solution. We can do this. But the sad reality for those who are now in refugee camps is that these things that we're saying here are not happening in this conflict-struck African countries. And the question they're having is, why? And how can we solve this? What do we do? When will we even do what we're saying that we need to do?
The impression I have, for instance, now is that everyone is looking his own interests. There I'm talking about Burundi crisis. I'm not even understanding how President Museveni, who has been appointed by his African community as mediator in the Burundi unrest, we even heard him at least issue a statement to condemn violence and killings.
He's campaigning for elections in his own...
He's busy with election.
So solutions. We have 6 minutes to go. How do we solve these things? How do we do it? What would you like to be done practically?
If we believe in this ideal of African problem with African solution, I think it's time that Africa leaders, there I'm talking about East African leaders, Great Lakes leaders, African Union, before even now, there is a discussion, for instance, about Burundi crisis at the UN Security Council. Before even UN Security Council comes out with a resolution, why not now African Union, East African leaders now start working on the problem, bringing the people in conflict together through dialogue. But unfortunately, Burundi president now doesn't want dialogue. He just wants violence. And of course, if he wants violence, if he's committed to kill his citizens, if he's committed to continue committing crimes against humanity, then international community has a duty, responsibility to intervene.
Yes. And that's the point where people always wonder, why should we always get to that point? That international community, that Western countries come and help us here.
To come back to the main point I was trying to make is that it comes to the responsibility of African states to come together. Even if there's a block or something, an obstacle preventing the East African community to act, even if there's an obstacle preventing the AU to act, find a way, come together. In the East African community, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, maybe come together if Tanzania is making a block.
Why are they not coming together? Why do you think they're not coming together? Because we cannot keep here and just be optimistic, but the reality on the ground, it's not happening like that. Why? What is stopping that?
Right. So there are things. I just have to briefly mention that I wrote this letter saying that Rwanda should do something and so on. But there are some dynamics in Burundi that make it very difficult. There are so many dynamics involved. So, for example, the president in Burundi has been playing the politics that Rwanda is destabilizing or planning to destabilize the country.
That is diversion.
It's diversion. Now, if Rwanda, for example, took the initiative to go in Burundi, that would vindicate his rhetoric. The conflict, to say things bluntly, I think there would be a genocide against Tutsis in Burundi. Because the militias that have been created, the Imbonerakure and the FDLR that has come to join.
So this is the projection.
This is
but
the
before
problem.
It happens,
now, what can
we do? Yes, this is the answer I'm looking for.
Prevent before react, of course.
But how do we do that?
What can be done? Tanzania is not going to move to support an East African standby force.
So if we know that is what is going to happen, so what
which is a shame, which is a tragedy. So what we need to do is to create another coalition of the willing. In this particular case, with all the willing people, because I'm sure there are some people who are willing to do this. But the action that would be is not a military confrontation, is to impose on Burundi both a permanent force based in Bujumbura to maintain peace, a peaceful force. It could be from Bangladesh, it could be from whenever, where Nkurunziza feels he trusts them, but a force that is there to maintain peace or to enforce peace, to ensure that at least this will protect the civilians. Another thing is targeted sanctions, travel bans, asset freezing, an international court.
Prosecution.
An international court that starts investigations.
Prosecution.
On individual, some people who arrest warrants issued on individual people.
But
so that they see that there is some...
You say prosecution. Who needs to carry out this prosecution? Who needs to carry out these cases?
Now the crimes committed in Burundi
crimes against humanity.
They are beyond the ability of national justice.
So you're talking
Crimes
ICC
against-
now.
I'm talking
Not,
about
not
that.
only
there's-
ICC.
there's a great
This is usually
example.
the problem, Archie. This is really the problem.
There's a great example.
Can't we have an African
Yes.
court of justice that deals with this? Must we say ICC?
There is a great example, actually, with the case of South Sudan.
Yes.
Recently, there was a commission of inquiry of the African Union to investigate what
Yes.
were the crimes in South Sudan exactly. And 1 month ago, there was news from Addis, from the African Union, that there would be a hybrid
Yes.
African Union court to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide.
So the
possibly
African Union
so
courts.
that's a great example of South Sudan. We still have to see how it comes about, how it is implemented, but that's an example right there. At least there's that willingness, there's that political willingness from the African Union, from African states, to create their own solutions.
All right.
And why not? And again, come back to Burundi, we talk about sanctions, we talk about travel bans from the US, from the EU, from the UN. That has really no impact.
From regional.
That has no impact, that's symbolic. Why don't you look at the region? If the region does sanctions, does trade embargoes, that has way more impact.
Who suffers? Who suffers?
Maybe
this?
the Burundian...
Is it the leader? Is it Nkurunziza? Or is it the population?
That's a good question. That's a
No, but-
question up for
but-
debate in development in general.
But the initiative to do so.
Yes.
The idea is there are some things that can be done, like we talked about enforcing a commission that goes to inquire,
Yes.
or these are things that can be done. Some other things are done just to show that people will not sit idle.
Yeah.
Some gestures are done to
And
just
it's better than nothing.
Than
Thank you
nothing.
so much. This is all the time. I'm being told we need to go for the news. It's very unfortunate when the debate becomes sweet. That is the time we're told, let's go.
It was the best part.
But of course, we'll keep this conversation going on. All you need to do is keep tweeting at Debate411. We're having this conversation going on right there. If there's still some statements you still want to argue against that are made right here, let's keep tweeting. I'm just going to be jumping there right about now to continue responding to some of your tweets. I see Olive Maria, Fiona Mbabazi, I see Annette, Mia, and Jayen. Thank you so much. Let's keep tweeting. Let's keep talking, because we need to do this now and every day. This has always been Debate411, and my name is always Eugene Anangwe. I'll see you again next week. Goodbye for now.